The Penobscot is one of the best examples anywhere of what can happen when a river is brought back to a more natural state. It's become somewhat of a poster river for the conservation movement, for anglers, for anyone interested in ecology and restoration. Not long ago, the Penobscot would be best described as dead, yet it was brought back to life, literally. The Penobscot proved not only is it possible to restore a river, there's tremendous ecological and even economic benefit in doing it. John Burrows knows this. He's the Atlantic Salmon Federation's Vice President of U.S. Operations and will tell anyone who'll listen about what's occurred on the river. I spoke to him next to the Androscoggin River in Brunswick, Maine, during spring runoff as the river surged. What's your relationship with the Penobscot, John?
So I've been involved with habitat restoration work and fisheries restoration work on the Penobscot River for about 25 years. The Atlantic Salmon Federation was a key partner in the Penobscot River Restoration Project. During that time, from the year 2000 to about 2015, I supported the project by doing grassroots outreach work and community work in the watershed.
Lots of people who have never been there will listen to this. Describe it to them.
So the Penobscot is Maine's largest watershed. Drains about a third of the state of Maine. Historically, it would have had a population of over 100,000 Atlantic salmon returning to it and tens of millions of river herring and other species. So massive watershed with huge migrations of sea-run fish. It's the ancestral home of the Penobscot Indian Nation. Their territory is still in the Penobscot River and islands in the river. And they've been stewards there for over 10,000 years and have been a major partner of ASF and other conservation groups to restore the Penobscot River. But it's a beautiful, rugged river that starts up in the mountains of interior Maine. The watershed goes basically up to the Quebec border in places, and it's a beautiful watershed and really important for Atlantic salmon restoration.
It was magnificent before humans got involved.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Penobscot, like every other river in New England, was really heavily dammed going back to the 1700s and then overfished, and then starting in the late 1800s started to become very heavily polluted with industry. So we did a pretty good number on the Penobscot and other places. Fortunately, we did not drive Atlantic salmon to extinction or eradicate the other species, and because of work of removing dams, opening up habitat on tributaries, we are seeing a pretty remarkable resurgence in terms of sea-run fish to the Penobscot River and other places. And it's pretty remarkable to see a watershed go from having a few thousand river herring to millions in a short period of time. And the life that those species bring back in terms of wildlife and other fish and birds, it's just really remarkable to see that ecological recovery happen very quickly.
And a life's work for you.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. There were dozens and dozens of people involved in the Penobscot project, and I had a fairly minor role there in terms of the project, but very worthwhile being involved and very rewarding. And the partnerships continue to this day with the Penobscot Nation, the other conservation groups that were involved in the project, and we're continuing to do more work. We're opening up more tributaries to the Penobscot, really important salmon tributaries, working on restoring more access to lakes and ponds for alewives. And so, the Penobscot project itself is done, but now we're focused on opening up some pretty key tributaries in the watershed.
Let's go back. How do you even begin this process of restoring a river?
Well, the key thing is, having some kind of community support or buy-in on things. Because of the number of dams and barriers that we have on our rivers, many of which have been there not just for decades, but sometimes for centuries, there's a lot of connection to those structures. And it's a very emotional conversation to talk about removing something, from a community, from a river that's been there for, an entire life of someone. And they're used to seeing that. And so going in and beginning a conversation with a landowner or a town about potentially removing this large structure on their river is not always easy to do. And oftentimes you get a very initial emotional reaction. We don't want change, and dam removal is big change. And so it's oftentimes takes a long time to get folks interested or, curious or more supportive of doing something like that. The good news is we know we've been removing dams pretty actively here in Maine for over a quarter century now, and we've got lots of great examples of success and for places for people to go and see a removed dam site, see a free-flowing river, and then see, the wildlife and the fish that have come back to that river. And so it gets a little bit easier over time, but without that support, you really can't do this type of work. So you really need support from a lot of different folks in the community, as well as agencies and tribes and other conservation groups to make progress on these things.
You also need a lot of money. You actually bought the dams.
Yeah, and so on the Penobscot, we purchased 3 dams for $25 million, which seemed like a massive amount of money. 20 years ago, the whole project was about $70 million from beginning to end for construction, acquisition, monitoring, permitting, legal work, all staffing, everything that goes into a project. Given the monumental success there, it's become a bit easier to get more money for other projects in that watershed or other watersheds in Maine because it's been such a great success story.
How do you physically remove a dam?
So the process for removing a dam is quite a bit like constructing a dam. The actual physical act of removing it involves backhoes and bulldozers and ram hose and trucking off pieces of dam, piece by piece, one load at a time to remove it. But leading up to that, it often takes many, many years of work on engineering and design work for the removal, permitting work, all kinds of consultations that need to get done. So the physical act of removing a dam could be done in basically one season, but it may take 4, 5, 6, 7 years or more to actually get to that point of doing that demolition. And the permitting that's involved is really, really extensive. And it's basically all the permits you would need to build a dam are the ones that you need to remove it. That's where things slow down and become costly, is making sure you're doing things right, complying with all the different state, local, federal laws, and having stamped engineering plans and lots of contractors and consultants doing the work and guiding along the way.
Once you've taken a dam down, when do you start to see restoration of the river itself and the ecosystem?
So the ecological restoration begins immediately. I think a great example of that is back in 1999, the Edwards Dam was removed on the Kennebec River. It was the first time that the federal government denied a license for a hydropower dam. There was a long, long legal regulatory battle throughout the 1990s that led to that. But the dam was breached in early July of 1999, and then within a few weeks, water quality monitoring that was done in the free-flowing reach of the river demonstrated that the aquatic insect community was already changing and improving, that dissolved oxygen levels were significantly higher than they were before. And so the ecosystem restoration recovery begins almost immediately. And all of that then feeds or builds up into higher levels of organisms benefiting from that. And so you had kind of remnant populations of some sea-run fish below the dam. Within a few weeks, we had sturgeon, 20 miles upriver in Waterville, Maine. And then over the years afterwards, the American shad started coming back, and blueback herring and alewives, and you started to see, increasing numbers year after year in terms of that recovery. And so it's really instantaneous. And for the sea-run fish that we're talking about, because of that work and work opening up tributary habitat and spawning habitat in places, we're really able to see exponential growth in some of those populations, both on the Kennebec and in the Penobscot River.
Does it happen organically, or do you also have to do restoration work after you take down a dam?
A lot of the stuff, starts to happen organically. In addition, usually for projects, removing large main stem dams opens up a lot of habitat for certain species, but for others that need to go much further up into headwater streams or headwater lakes and ponds, oftentimes we've got to do a lot more work, making sure that fish can get from point A to point B, and sometimes that involves a handful of large main stem dams and then a number of small tributary dams in places. In addition to that, on the Penobscot River, leading up to the dam removals, there was active restoration of alewives in lakes and ponds where they go to spawn. And so for a number of years, the state of Maine would truck small numbers of alewives from lower in the watershed or from a different watershed and take them into the lakes and ponds to jumpstart a run of alewives. And they did that because that species was not present in those places for a couple of hundred years, and able to kind of initiate things. They do that small level of stocking for 4 years and then let Mother Nature take over. And so on the Penobscot River, at the very first dam, which was the VZ Dam, the fish passage was incredibly poor. Only Atlantic salmon and American eel essentially were able to get above that. So species like alewives or American shad very, very rarely got above that dam. So the number of alewives getting into lakes and ponds upstream of VZ was essentially zero. So after completion of the project in 2015, from then until now, we've seen a growth of the alewife population from essentially zero above VZ Dam to about 7 or 8 million now, and seeing that population continue to grow. So that's a pretty impressive change in numbers over just 2 generations of fish.
How many salmon have followed?
So on the Atlantic salmon front, it's much more difficult for recovery or restoring the species. And so we've seen basically a leveling of the Atlantic salmon population, an increase in wild salmon coming back, but the run is still predominantly fish that come from some component of a hatchery system. But we have seen, compared to about 20 years ago, a bit of an increase there. I mean, it's kind of holding its own at this point. We're hoping, in time, as we open up more habitat, that we're going to continue to see that increased growth in the salmon population. But the key thing is that we're seeing more and more truly wild Atlantic salmon coming back as we remove those dams. And that's our measure for success, is eventually not having any hatcheries supporting the population and really getting a run back which is truly wild.
Do you think that's possible, that you could get a run back that compares to historic runs?
We're never going to get a run back on the Penobscot that's going to be in the tens of thousands or 100,000 plus fish like it was historically. But I think because of the work that we've done and the work we're continuing to do on certain tributaries like the Piscataquis, we can definitely get a self-sustaining run back in 10,000 fish or more. That's, I think, certainly very doable to have happen. Right now, the annual return is about 1,600 adult salmon to the watershed. And as we're continuing to do more dam removal work and other restoration, I definitely am very hopeful that we're going to continue to see that increase in salmon adult returns.
1,500 compared to, say, 15 years ago.
Yeah, so the run back, before the dams came out on the Penobscot River, it varied from year to year. In some years it was a few hundred. In a handful of years we had over 2,000. So year to year it would vary quite a bit. But I would say that the average from 20, 25 years ago compared to now, we're definitely higher than we were then, probably by order of 20, 30, 40%. But again, from year to year, you can see wild swings in the returns.
Are you seeing improvements in the greater ecosystem too, with bird life, with other species of fish?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing massive improvements in terms of water quality, the water chemistry, the aquatic insect community, forage fish like the river herring. And for Maine and for the northeastern states, historically the runs of river herring, American shad, would have far outnumbered our runs of Atlantic salmon. So that biomass is really in those species. And that's where we're seeing massive restoration and recovery, really going from rivers that had none of those fish to hundreds or a few thousand up to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and now in the millions in terms of river herring species. And as you bring back that forage base, you're feeding eagles, ospreys, river otters, you're feeding striped bass and cod and haddock and whales in the Gulf of Maine and seabirds. So we're seeing a real massive ecosystem recovery that extends from headwater streams in the mountains all the way out to the Gulf of Maine.
How about for people? Has their attitude toward the river changed?
No, I think so. Particularly in Maine, if we go back 40 or 50 years, our rivers were so heavily polluted, particularly our large rivers from industry, and they're heavily dammed. So people, did not really recreate on our large rivers because of that stuff. But because of the Clean Water Act and huge improvements in water quality, because of the removal of a number of these dams, communities and people have really kind of turned back to the rivers and really have embraced them. So you see a lot more people out, kayaking, paddling, bird watching, doing all that stuff along our rivers where not too long ago people just did not do that in a lot of these places.
And for the Penobscot Nation?
Huge benefits for the Penobscot Nation. They've been in the Penobscot watershed for over 10,000 years, and the river is really synonymous with the Penobscots, and they've relied on it for generation after generation for sustenance. They've got a strong spiritual connection to the watershed and the fish and wildlife resources that are there. And so having them now have a run of river herring, that's approaching 10 million swimming on their reservation, in their land, in their waters, having that species improve the whole ecosystem and providing benefits to other fish and wildlife is really, really important to the tribe, and they are still heavily engaged with us on continuing to open up tributaries in the watershed and getting resurgence of these fish species back to the entire watershed. And so it's just, that's one of the aspects of being involved in the project, which is most rewarding, is working with the Penobscots on removing the dams and having their support and their partnership in that, because we know how much the river means to them, has meant to them for so much longer than any of us have been here.
Can you see further dam removal in the future?
No, I think so. We're actually actively working on removing a couple of significant dams on a major tributary, the Piscataquis River, and we're also working to improve fish passage at the main stem dams that remain in the watershed. And yeah, we're going to continue to open up more and more habitat there and get these fish species there. And so that's why I'm really optimistic that we're going to see meaningful increases in Atlantic salmon restoration over time, and more salmon coming back, and just continue to see this ecological recovery happen throughout the entire watershed.
When you look back at the last 25 years, what are you most proud of?
Oh, great. That's a great question. I think being involved in the community of folks doing fisheries and ecosystem restoration has been incredibly rewarding. There's a lot more of us now than there were 25 years ago. Seeing the results from that hard work on the Penobscot is just incredibly rewarding and inspiring. I think for everyone that was involved in the Penobscot River Restoration Project, we've got a tremendous sense of pride in that, but also because everyone else in Maine has seen the recovery, and a lot more communities and groups want the same thing to happen on their rivers, regardless of the size, whether it's a small stream with a small river herring run or another large watershed. People are seeing the benefits, and they say, we want that to happen here in our river as well. And so, being involved in something that's inspiring the next generation of conservationists is definitely very rewarding.
I've heard that the Penobscot is a bit of an example of what can happen to a river that was almost dead.
Oh, absolutely. I think the Penobscot was a great model for work that was done in the western U.S. on the Klamath River in particular. Something that was happening around the same time period, but folks out there were looking at the Penobscot River as a source of inspiration for what they could do. And there's a lot of talk here in the U.S. about removing 4 dams on the Snake River in the Columbia watershed out west. And everyone out there is well aware of the results here in Maine on the Penobscot and also on the Kennebec River, where we've seen meaningful restoration as well.
Let's look ahead 5 years. What do you hope to see? And then what's the future do you hope for the Penobscot?
In 5 years, I'm expecting to see the river herring run in the Penobscot exceed 10 million fish. I'm also pretty optimistic that we're going to remove at least one more major dam on the Piscataquis River and reduce the number of barriers that Atlantic salmon have to go through to get to some really, really good climate resilient cold water habitat in the upper Piscataquis. I also know that we're going to continue to see culverts replaced in the watershed of small streams and river herring or trout accessing new habitat, and we're going to open up, I think, probably several hundred more miles of tributary habitat and fully connect that to the ocean. So we're going to see continual increases in sea run fish coming back to the watershed, and just an increase in kind of general ecological health of the watershed in the future.
Thank you for listening to the Saving Salmon podcast, a podcast produced by the Atlantic Salmon Federation. You can get more information and episodes on our website, www.asf.ca, or wherever you get your podcasts.